RxRevu founder Carm Huntress has been an entrepreneur since high school, when he founded a tech company with some of his buddies. After graduating from college and leading various technology organizations, he made the jump to healthcare. RxRevu spent a lot of time searching for product market fit before finding its sweet spot in the physician workflow, helping doctors make the best prescribing choices for patients at the point of care. In this episode of the HealthBiz podcast, Carm shares his life and career journey, from losing both of his parents to cancer at a young age, to exploring new technologies, and to founding and then massively scaling RxRevu. Some of my interviewees don't have time to read, but Carm reads dozens of books per year. Some of his recent favorites include Powerful, No Rules Rules, Codebreaker, and How the Mighty Fall. I'm your host, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. We help fast-growing companies like RxRevu make informed strategic choices. Carm Huntress from RxRevu, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I had a look at your background. You've done a whole bunch of interesting things, starting early, I think, in high school. So we're gonna wind back the clock a little bit.
Oh gosh, we're gonna do the full career history. I'm excited.
We won't do the we won't ask everything that you did in high school, just the stuff that's suitable for family podcast here. But yeah, indeed. So tell me a little bit about your background, your upbringing. What were your childhood influences like, even before high school?
Oh, wow. So I think probably the most interesting thing about my childhood is I actually lost both my parents at a very young age. I lost both my mother and father to cancer by the time I was 15. And that was kind of a defining thing for my life. I tell friends, like, instead of playing on the playground, I was like sitting there thinking about the meaning of life, of like, why on earth did the universe take both my parents, not just one. But I had a great brother and sister and a great support, local town in Western Massachusetts of a great community of people that really took care of me, and got my way through high school, got my way through college, and got through that. And that was really defining for me. And then, on the business front, it was the late 90s. And, I was sort of when I was 16, 17, I really wanted to get into technology, and I had my first, I think I had an IBM PS2 at that time, I just loved technology, and I saw the internet coming, and then a really good friend of mine and I started a kind of do it everything business. At that time, we did hosting, we helped build computers for people, we did websites. We really did everything under the sun, and it was super fun. And at that time, you could actually make a lot of money for a high school kid,
right,
in the internet. And that sort of launched my career. And I just had this passion for being an entrepreneur, having my own business. It was super fun, and that led me down a whole path of through college, I had a business, and just kept going, kind of grew up in tech, sort of the tech side of the business. So programming, product management, eventually grew up into a CTO. But I had a lot of, really interesting, instrumental, what I would call tours of duty.
Yeah.
I worked in early RFID technology. I worked in early voice technology, voice XML technology. I had a stint at a recruiting company in the recruiting space, which was fascinating. And kind of worked in big data before big data was big data, and then eventually ended up in high-end audio and kind of worked at this site called.
It all makes sense. It all makes sense, I guess, when you look at it that way. A lot of these things happen, I think, as a product of when you're coming up and what's going on at the time. I think Bill Gates was successful because it was the time to bring all the things together that he did. And in high school, I actually had a computer, but it had an acoustic coupler. So they had ARPANET then, but they didn't have anything beyond that. But so now tell me, Green Beetle, I think that was the name of your high school company. What was that like? It was one word, but like, is a Green Beetle a thing, or was one like
no, it was around? Just, back then, those were the days of like Razorfish, if you remember that company.
Sure.
And there were these big kind of web design shops, and we had this aspiration to do kind of the same thing. And that's where Green Beetle Technology. So we were kind of a web design hosting company at that time.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience. It was like, four of us guys, we were all kind of, late high school age and in a bit into college, and we really enjoyed it. It was a really fun time and sort of the foundation of the internet being
Yeah.
built and early browsers, and so that was a good run early in my career, and that taught me a lot of fundamentals about web technology,
Yeah.
HTML and HTTP and those technologies, and even networking to some extent. So those were good fundamental sort of technology endeavors for me to get the base skills I needed to then build upon those throughout my career.
And so, on the tech side, it sounds like you then were looking at a lot of kind of emerging things. You talked about, high-end audio, all these different areas that you were getting into. Now, in my world, everything is healthcare. So usually it's kind of like everything gets to healthcare. And it's partly you talk about the growth of healthcare costs, and you say, like, eventually everybody's going to be, in healthcare or in the hospital or whatever. And you got there sooner than most. But what was behind that shift from kind of more pure tech side into something that's more healthcare specific?
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me because I was in my early 30s, or I just turned 30, and I was really starting, I think, the 20s was such a sort of a decade of self-discovery for me, right? And both personally and on the career side of like kind of figuring out what I wanted in life. And that was really instrumental, and playing a lot of roles. When you're in a startup, you get to play a lot of different roles. And I just have always loved being the founder and the leader. I love leading people. I love bringing people together. I love building teams. And, I was thinking a lot about my career and what I was passionate about. And what what I love is sort of this, what I realized is I had worked really hard. I had created a lot of financial success, but I also didn't feel like I had contributed
Yeah.
in a meaningful way, right? I think as we get older, we want to be, you want to be more useful. Like you realize, the thing that really brings you career satisfaction is being useful to the world. And the bigger impact you can have on the world, the more meaningful the work typically is. And making money is just a measurement of that success.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the framework I approach work. And so that was my realization. And so I was really, when I kind of ended up here in Denver, and I had kind of had a fresh start, and was looking for a new career opportunity. I wanted to run a company. I wanted to be mission driven. And, this is, sort of 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
And so healthcare was, this explosion kind of starting in 2010 of venture capital dollars was flowing in. And so I really started to look at healthcare as one of the key opportunities for me. And with my family history and everything else, it was just, it was kind of lined up. And then serendipitously, I got introduced to a guy named Dr. Kevin O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I sat down over breakfast, and he was a pulmonologist who sort of had done this whole endeavor over a 3-year period to sort of rank the cost and quality of drugs in a reference book.
Yeah.
And I saw this book, and it just blew me away.
Yeah.
And that was like, okay, there's something here, right, about sort of the cost and quality of drugs and consumers being totally confused by this. There's got to be a business here. So that was kind of the path to getting to RxRevu and why I was after
Interesting.
something more mission driven.
And what was, the good thing about when you look in healthcare, there's all sorts of needs. You don't have to invent a need. There's all sorts of problems that come about, as a result of that. And it sounds like you had found from, this pulmonologist that he had kind of documented something. Now, clearly there was an opportunity then to leverage that, because if it's in a book, you're not going to get all the value out of it. But how did you think about going from that kind of insight that he had generated, that kind of aha moment that you had when looking at it, into like, what's the concept for the company? How did that happen?
Yeah, we probably made, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 really distinct pivots as we built the company. We came into the market trying a few things. One thing we first tried was just selling data, sort of clinical, sort of taking Kevin's sort of key insights around the clinical efficacy and cost of these drugs, and then offering that as a data resource. And to 2 companies who wanted that type of data for their users that were in the healthcare space. That went okay. We actually got some deals around that, but it didn't. The market opportunity just was not as large as we, I think, hoped. And then we did, GoodRx was kind of in the market and starting to really scale at that time, and so we tried to also tackle the market at one point, looking at, sort of consumer cost transparency around drugs, but then layering in the clinical efficacy.
Yeah.
And we tried that for a while. It was very hard, and this was sort of the aha moment of we were trying to get these reports to patients to take to their doctors, and then we sort of started having this discussion. Well, you don't really make the ultimate decision of what prescription you get. That's a
Yeah.
clinical decision, guided by your provider. Shouldn't we be helping the provider at the point of care? And I would say that was a pretty definitive pivot where we said, and I had people who left the company because of this,
Yeah.
where I said, look, we got to get to the point of care. It's early. This is going to be challenging, but we've got to help providers make better decisions. They're, about 6.5 billion drugs are prescribed each year. Those
Yeah.
are all those decisions are made by doctors, right? Consumers don't make those decisions. And so we've got to really help the doctors make a lot better decisions, and they don't have all the data they really should have. And then I'd say the last big thing, and we can talk more specifically of, the experiments we did along that path, was this emergence of cost transparency.
Mm-hmm.
We were working in sort of the more global clinical decision support space where we were combining clinical and cost data. But the large payers and PBMs started to bring real-time cost transparency for drugs, real-time benefit check, RTPB, to the market. And we were in discussions with a lot of those payers because we wanted the cost data. And they said, hey, why don't you start using these new APIs?
Yeah.
And so that was another pivotal moment. And we ultimately said, let's stop doing the clinical stuff and just focus on the cost transparency, because if we can get that data at scale to providers, that's a huge impact we can have in terms of, improving patient care, making sure patients can afford their drugs, and ultimately be adherent on those drugs. And so that was sort of the last way. And then we finally hit product market fit. I think the last thing I'll say is that, timing is everything. I think if you look at the data, half of all startup success is timing.
Yeah.
And I would argue we were probably a year or two early. And so we had a tough couple years of kind of waiting for the market to mature and people really being, and even providers being ready to have this data as part of their prescribing workflow. So it was an interesting journey to end up where we are today.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar there. Just going back to the comment before about Bill Gates, and it was his time. You get the product market fit. Well, the APIs weren't there 18 months earlier, probably. So, would you say, like, I'm trained in economics, so we say, like, assume an API. If we assume we have this, and then we can do all these other pieces. So that was nice that it came together. And part of, on the one hand, you could say you were early. On the other hand, because you'd gone down these other paths, then you could sort of recognize, okay, this is actually something that we want, and you could sort of see where it's going to come, because everything happens pretty slowly in healthcare. Healthcare has a reputation for having all sorts of challenges, like third-party payment. I mean, normally, like you talked about high-end audio, usually somebody knows what something costs when they buy it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's already a given that the cost. So are there, when you're searching for the product market fit in healthcare, I mean, on the one hand, it's less obvious because you're not dealing with the typical forces of supply and demand. But also, is there something about how healthcare is evaluated? You're dealing with people's health and very serious matters that affects how you do the measurement.
I think there's probably three things I'd point out that are really unique about healthcare and our market, maybe in particular. I'd say the first thing was the recognition that providers really are making all the decisions. I love Atul Gawande's quote, the most expensive medical device ever made is the doctor's pen.
Yeah.
And the end of that quote that gets cut off that's really important is, doctors order all the cost of healthcare. They order all the money of healthcare. And that's a first thing you kind of realize is that we've invested, if you look at venture capital in the tens of billions of dollars, I think we're at 40 or $50 billion have been invested now over the last decade in healthcare startups. The vast majority went to consumer-driven health, companies. Well, it turns out, we've invested all that money. Do we really feel like healthcare has truly changed?
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, I'd say there's maybe been a few successes, but nothing like dramatic. And I think we really need to more focus on the system and the doctor. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is really about the value chains. We had to get the economic model right. And I think when I talk to a lot of healthcare, entrepreneurs, which I do a lot more often now, what I see most commonly is they're coming at the market from a very consumer driven sort of supply and demand traditional curves. That's just not healthcare works. The complexity of these value chains lead to kind of a rational, buying, and
Yeah.
we're seated in fee for service. And so you might want to do something that's great for the consumer, makes the market a lot more efficiency, but nobody will
Yeah.
buy it because you're
They'll go out
going.
of business if they do,
Yeah,
you know?
if you did it, I think a simple example is like what COVID did. Like if all the surgery stopped, all the elective stuff stopped, and these health systems started hemorrhaging $50-100 million a month
Yeah.
Of cash. So if you came in and say, hey, I have this really great thing, it's going to get all these patients to avoid surgeries, most hospitals would kick you out
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
they
so
need those.
they say I already had that. It's called COVID.
Yeah, it's COVID, right? So I think there's just something really fundamentally important when you enter into healthcare to understand the value chain. So for us, right, at first we did charge hospitals and doctors for our technology. But when you think about optimizing a patient's drugs, the beneficiaries are the patient and their health plan, right? The
Yeah.
insurer. If we can lower those costs or avoid a prior auth, that really benefits the plan, not really the doctor or the
Yeah.
system. And so, our recommend, we actually don't charge doctors. We give the data to them for free. We charge the payers and PBMs economically because they're the ones that save money and ultimately get the ROI if we do our job right. And so that's really, I think those are two big things. The third thing I'd say is, what was so interesting to me and the learnings we had to go through to become kind of world experts in getting into these clinical workflows, is one, you have to be in the workflow. This idea that you can have a portal or some kind of app, it's, retraining doctors on these workflows is just untenable.
Yeah.
You've got to embed yourself, in our case, in the prescribing workflow. And what was so interesting to me was, it wasn't, patient care is important to doctors. But if you can save them clicks and lower their cognitive load,
Yep.
they like you way better. They care about patient care, and sometimes we spend a lot of time prioritizing that. But when we showed up and say, look, this is going to save administrative times, this is less clicks, and it's going to lower your cognitive load because you're not kind of overwhelmed with pharmacy callbacks and dealing with prior auths. When we started to really talk to doctors about that, they went, oh my gosh, I got staff 10 hours, 20 hours a week now filling out prior auth forms. If I can just avoid a couple of those a week, like that's hugely helpful for me.
Yeah.
Those were the kind of things we had to learn along the path to really get to product market fit. And then, having great partners like the EHRs that we work with that really helped us scale the technology to, now we're about 200,000 docs that use our network for real-time cost transparency.
Great. That was my next question, because when you talk about the workflow, you're typically talking these days about the electronic medical record. Didn't used to be, but now it is. As you said, since 2010 is essentially when these things have come in. You've announced a number of partnerships. So can you say a little bit about some of those key partnerships that are in place and how they work specifically?
Yeah, our three biggest, I'll talk about the electronic health record side first. So we work today with the three largest ambulatory providers, Epic, Cerner, and Athena. And what we're, obviously, we bring them real-time cost data, but what they've done is they've enabled capabilities for our network to run directly in the prescribing workflow.
Yeah.
So as soon as a doctor pens a drug, says, picks a drug for a patient they want to prescribe, we price that in real time. We show them the cost. We might show them something less expensive or a better pharmacy or something that doesn't have a prior authorization on it, which is hugely beneficial to the doctor. And then they can just, click to the alternative and update the order right in their workflow and then, route it to the pharmacy. So that's what the EHRs give us. And having that embedded experience is really what doctors have always wanted. And they don't want to go off to a portal or an app. And it really needs to be seamless, right? They shouldn't have to do a bunch of extra work. Just, it just shows up in their native EHR. And then we have established relationships with large payers like United Healthcare, that we collectively add up to about 150 million covered lives. We can do this real-time pricing for. Mm-hmm. And I'm so happy that, CMS has come forward. Now there's a mandate around this that payers who support Part D lives have to provide this data. So we expect that network to grow. And our ultimate goal, obviously, is to get to every insured individual in the US so we can do pricing for anyone and be an all-payer solution. And I think we'll slowly get there over time. But bringing that together, right, having the network of payers and PBMs to do pricing in real time, and then the EHR relationships, have really enabled us to scale dramatically. A few years ago, we were only a few thousand docs. Now we're
Yep.
200,000 docs. I don't know of many other digital health companies that can have scaled like that.
Yeah.
I think it's like something like 22x growth and 17,000% in 3 years.
Nice. Yeah.
It's been extremely hard, especially with COVID last year, scaling the company
Yeah.
to where we are today. But that's how our network works today and our key partnerships.
No, it's very interesting. If I think about what's happened with electronic medical records, and one reason that doctors don't like them is that they haven't liked them, at least historically, is that you're having administrative tasks done by the physician that used to be done maybe inefficiently, but they were done elsewhere by people that didn't have that same level of training and maybe weren't as valuable to the patient. What sounds interesting about this, so like in the olden days, if a physician would prescribe a drug without thinking about whether it was covered and what the price would be, you're going to get some rework later, because when the patient gets to the pharmacy, they're going to find out it's not covered, they can't afford it or whatever, and there'll be some interventions, a lot of back and forth, and it'll be slow. Doesn't impact the doctor. Here it sounds like what you're doing is you're making it so that you're catching the issue upstream and dealing with it then, and really with the physician, who's the best one to make that trade-off once they see, okay, this one's covered, this one isn't. And you're doing it in a way that doesn't require the physician to have the extra clicks and the cognitive load and so on. So I can see how that is the product market fit, essentially, that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think this is the key thing about our business is that providers today don't have benefit, cost, and coverage information in real time when they're making these decisions, and it's led to this huge amount of irrationality around these decisions and a huge amount of waste and cost. And it's not like doctors, I think this sort of notion that like doctors hate technology and all this stuff, like they hate bad technology, just like as
Right.
if you download an app on your phone that you don't like,
Yeah.
you don't
Give
like
it a bad
technology
review
either.
and you give it
Yeah,
a bad review and you leave it. You don't have your
and you
employer
leave it,
tell you to
right?
keep using it.
And so if you can give, providers what they need in the moment to make the most informed decision, guess what? They want to do that for their patients. They
Yeah.
want that, right? That's a very honest thing for them to do and the right thing for them to do. And I think that that's a really our job as a company is like, they just don't have the data today. And if
Yeah.
we can be thoughtful stewards and get it to the point, right place, right timing, make it easy on them, lower that cognitive load, reduce those clicks for them, that's the win for us. And I think, we can, really reduce the overall cost of healthcare by tens or hundreds of billions of dollars if we can bring this data thoughtfully to their point of care. And I think the great thing is providers and EHRs are really starting to wake up of this benefit they can offer to their providers to really improve their workflows and decision-making capabilities and kind of avoid all this administrative waste that we deal with today.
You mentioned that scaling has been a challenge during the pandemic. I think scaling is always a challenge, so maybe doubly so in the pandemic. Say a little bit more about your what your experience has been like over the last year and a half or so scaling up the company during
Yeah, well,
COVID-19.
we had some sort of when we kind of made the turn into just being a data network for EHRs with this cost transparency information. We had to shut down some products. We actually kind of had products that were live in health systems. And we said, look, we can't even, we're a small company. We can't kind of do both at once. And we've got to put all our energy into building a phenomenal network. The complexity of these, we sort of talk about like, this is just a standard API and it's like a transaction. This isn't modern tech on really both sides of the equation. And so what I mean by that is on the payer PBM side, when we run these transactions, we're literally running a trial claim. It's the equivalent of that. And so we're touching these incredibly antiquated claim systems that have been around forever.
I was going to say like IBM 360. You're getting back to like the history of technology.
We're going way back. And then the second part that's difficult is the way the data comes to us is it looks more like a claim than it looks like what a doctor would want to make a decision about. So you get these weird codes, for instance, we get a 44. Well, what does a 44 mean to a doctor? Oh, it means that drug's not covered.
Yeah.
And so the amount of massaging and translation we have to do is very intense and on a per payer basis, right? And so every single payer we connect to is a little different from their flavor of real-time benefit. for prescription drugs is a little different. And so we have to do a lot of massaging. And then, on the EHR side, the experience for the provider changes depending on the electronic health record. And so we have to do specific things to say, okay, how do we want the data to show up? What can we show? What can't we show? And so there's this huge amount of effort we had to put in to do this. And then it started to go really fast at the same time where, I'll never forget the day we went live with one of our largest EHR partners. And I think we were doing, less than 10 transactions a minute, and we went to a few hundred a minute.
Right. Yeah.
Instantaneously. And, it was like staring at the screen, like, hold on for dear life.
Right.
We had to do a huge amount of work in our cloud computing infrastructure to handle that kind of load, make sure these transactions run smoothly, and catch all the errors so we could continue to refine the system. So those types of challenges you just don't typically see, right? Most startups kind of go through, even good ones go through a kind of linear growth. We went really through a hockey stick of growth. And, when, we were running maybe a few thousand transactions a few years ago a month, we do a few million a month now.
Right.
And this thing has to be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Obviously doctors are seeing patients any time of the day. We support, emergency departments. We support discharge. We support ambulatory care. We support specialty clinics. And so you've got to be able to handle all that stuff all the time. And you have to really build a robust infrastructure. But, I think our uptime is 99.998. We really do not go down. And I think that's a testament to our engineering team and Gabe Hesse and Lou Parker, who run our engineering organization and really have done a phenomenal job to build something that's highly scalable.
Great. So, Carm, part of the reward and success for getting to this point is you're now shifted into a new role as a chief innovation officer, as I understand, and brought in a CEO. What's that been like, and what was that decision about?
Well, look, I've been running the company for 8 years. And, you've got to just sort of look at where you are in your career and what you've done. I'd say, the last 3 years in particular have been extremely hard.
Yeah.
And, I'm really happy about the growth, to sit here and say, hey, look, we grew 17,000% in 3 years. I get to take that and put that on my resume. But it was just time, I think. And I think the scale of our revenue and where we're going, you have to look at sort of where your strengths are. And so I really play well to that 0 to, 20 million in annual revenue. But you start to get up to, you start to get closer and closer to 100 employees. It's a very different business, right? You have to think about middle management. You have to think about processes and organizational design and structure and teams. And we're doing a lot more now. We're doing work in outside of drug cost transparency. Now we're doing work in electronic prior auth. We're doing work in medical cost transparency, and a bunch of other stuff. And so it's just a really different business now. And so, it's very common, I'd say, in the startup world, as companies reach these points of scale, to see a guy like me still help the company and still be supportive, but bring in other people who have deep operational experience and have done this before, and to help scale the company from here.
That makes sense. So last question is just about reading. Any time for books? Sounds like you haven't had any problem in the last 3 years, but anything you're reading, anything you would recommend?
Well, this is funny. I think this is very important for entrepreneurs. I see this in great entrepreneurs. I probably read 35 books last year.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important because, you don't, if you're a good entrepreneur and you're scaling very fast, you have to grow with the business. You're the only one, right, that can, that has to scale. Everybody else can kind of move around and find new roles. You're the CEO and founder. You're in the seat.
Yeah.
And humans are terribly bad at exponential growth. We're very linear beings, and most of us hate change. So it's doubly bad. And so I really think you have to have a commitment to constant learning and growth. And so, gosh, there's so much stuff that I've been digging in. I'd say, books that I loved last year were Powerful, which is a little bit of the Netflix starting story.
Yeah.
No Rules was great, which Reed Hastings just came out with. If you're a science nut, I would read Walter Isaacson's Codebreaker about Jennifer Dowda and bringing CRISPR and Cas9
Yep.
to the market. Those are great books. I'd also do one more, which I've really enjoyed going back to, is I've really been rereading now that I went through this phase of growth, Jim Collins' work.
Yeah.
Good to Great, Why the Mighty Fail. And he has this wonderful map and framework he's developed that really walks through, disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action. And I really think that's he looks at very large companies and much larger companies. What I think so fascinating is these rules are so necessary in a startup. You want disciplined people. You want the right people on the bus. You have to have disciplined thought and disciplined execution because you only have so much time and money.
Yeah.
And you have to really do that well. And then you have to have disciplined action. And if you really understand the core tenets of that and what you need to do, I think it adds up to a really phenomenal framework for startups and a phenomenal way to think about execution and what you have to do with the short amount of time and capital most startups typically have.
Great. Excellent. Those are some good recommendations there, Carm. Some overlap, I would say, with my previous guests and some new ones as well. But I'm glad you're able to do that one. So great. So Carm Huntress, founder and chief innovation officer of RxRevu, thank you so much for your time today on the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.